All right, thank you so much. My name is Fred Diamond. Welcome to the fifth episode, the fifth of seven, John Knotts, on the Crossing the Zone of Fear podcast. Of course, I'm Fred Diamond. I'm the co-founder of the Institute for Excellence in Sales and the host of the Sales Game Changers podcast. You're probably listening to this as a Sales Game Changers podcast, or you're watching on YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube, please go give us a thumbs up. So, John Knotts, you're the author of Crossing the Zone of Fear. And what we're doing for people here who are watching for the first time, or if you're with us for the entire 5 of 7 ride, thank you so much. Basically, we're addressing fear. And, as we talked a couple of times, John, we're talking about how you can really live a fulfilled life. And one thing I've mentioned this before, one thing that's come up for me since we've been starting this is that there's fear in almost everything we do. Now, crossing the street. Now, that may not be a big deal to most people, especially when you cross, at a green light with the pedestrian sign. But for some people, just getting out of bed. And we've talked about business fears, which are now what's happened for me. And I used this example before, when you're going to go buy a red car, all you see is red cars. For me, fear is coming up all the time, and it's been helping me. And I'm not like fear as in like timid where I'm sitting in the corner every day. It's like, okay, why am I not making a phone call to a customer, someone who is already a customer who likes me? I need to make a phone call. Why am I not calling them when they already like me? So, there's a fear there for some reason. Now, of course, even in sales, it's much harder to call someone who doesn't like you, who doesn't know you, who doesn't know about your solution that you are challenged with and tasked with getting to become a customer. There may be some bigger things that we're talking on today's show. It's our fifth about where the fears come from. So, John, it's great to see you. How have you felt going through this journey with me? And again, we're on episode 5 today.
I just had a conversation yesterday with a coaching client about fear, and the emphasis as we move through this book and where we get to right now. Now we're starting to really uncover the fact that, as you said, we all experience fears throughout the day. It's just that some of us have, when we talked about the whole idea of expanding your comfort zone by facing fears and working through that. So some of us have gotten over the apprehension of, like, I'm not going to do this. But you think about just the point that you said, crossing the street. What do we do when we cross the street? We look both ways, right?
Mm.
Why do we do that?
Mm.
Because it's ingrained in us from our parents, our family.
Mm.
Before you cross the street, John, look both ways. You don't want to get run over. It's a fear that is being pushed on us as children.
Mm.
And that's really what we're getting into now. We've gone through the concepts of what fear is, the different types of fear, what it's doing to you from a comfort zone perspective. And now we're moving into, where do these things actually really originate from?
Yeah.
And as we start to, because now the visibility aperture is opened, and you're like, I actually have a little bit of fear of that. I have a little bit of fear of that, but we don't really register as fear. So I told you before we got on this, I'm gonna be a little vulnerable. So I have very pale skin.
Mm.
I am milky white, probably my German heritage, because my
Mm.
family originally came from Germany. But I'm really a very pale person, and I hardly ever wear shorts.
Mm.
Like if a swimsuit, okay, I'll be in the water. But I just, like the whole thing is I'm super white. And when I get into the sun, I will burn like a lobster. But it's always been something that has bothered me. And I was sitting there thinking about this before we got on this call. And I'm like, where the heck does all that come from? And I know that as a kid, we all get picked on. Like everybody gets picked on as a kid. It's just the magnitude of that and how we deal with it. And I know I was picked on because I was white, because I, like pale white, not just
Mm.
because I'm a white guy, but because I'm so milky white, like everybody would just make fun of you. Oh, hey, glass of milk, what's going on? You're gonna burn like crazy. And so I got to the point where I wore jeans like all the time, even when it's
Mm.
110 degrees outside. They're like, "What are you doing in jeans?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I don't want to blind you."
Mm.
But you think about that. So this is the vulnerable point.
Yeah.
So when when I started going to gym in high school, they had gang latrines. It's the open shower
Mm.
bays. And I did not want to be in that shower bay, milky white me,
Mm.
and get picked on. So I would, after gym, I would just get dressed and leave. Well, kids, like they don't miss anything. And of course they saw that and they're like, oh, like you're sweaty and nasty, and then you put on your clothes and you go in. And I got the nickname Hugh Man, Hugh Man, Hugh.
Yeah.
And yeah, from my friends, that's all my friends. And they, like they started calling me that. And you reflect back on these things. Now, one of the things
Mm.
that I've learned is that when something like that takes a hold of you, is you own it. You gotta own it. And to me, I own the nickname. I didn't let it control me. I controlled it. And now it's like the thing. I see my friends 40 plus years later. I just had my 40th reunion from high school. And we still, like, when we see each other, like, what's up? And, we'll go into a crowded theater or something and we know somebody else is in there, out loud. And we know what that means. And it's so I never let that own me. I never let the name, the fear of it, and the fear of the fact that I'm not really happy and comfortable being in shorts and a no shirt in a pool or something like that.
Yeah.
And this is what happens over time. We're conditioned to things. It may be through experiences, it may be through our relationships with our family and our friends, but something ingrained in us happened long ago.
Yeah. Tell me again the acronym that you use for fear.
False evidence appearing real.
So as you go
Very
through this
popular.
chat, yep, as we go through this chapter, the sources of fear, as you're talking now, again, I host the Sales Game Changers podcast, and we talk to sales leaders about why they became a sales leader, whatever. And it's interesting, the story that you just told, one person's response could be completely different from another person's response.
Absolutely.
And you talk here about trauma in this chapter, traumatic events,
Mhm.
and it could be things you talk about, almost getting bitten by a dog. And for people who are listening to the show, as I also do a podcast on Lyme disease awareness,
Mhm.
and there's a very common notion that you need to address childhood trauma before you can recover from chronic illness. So some people, I've dealt with people over the last couple of years, John, who've dealt with some real serious stuff, abuse as a child, if you will. But when we talk to some people may take that abuse as, I'm going to live in the woods in a shack and never interface with humans. And someone else can say, I'm going to save the world, because
Mhm.
of how I was treated. I'm going to make sure that no one, excuse me, no one else gets treated that way. And the same thing in business and sales. Somebody may come through something and it's like, I, I want to be an accountant, or I want to sit in a cube, right? Or I want to be a data analyst. Yeah, we need those people, of course, but I don't have to interface with people now, especially again, we're doing today's interview towards the end of the summer of 2024. People can work from home in their apartment near the beach or in the mountains or some
In their
wherever
hotel room.
in their hotel room, like I'm right now. Or they can also choose to say, I'm afraid of, in theory, of nothing. Now, we all know from the book, there's fears that maybe seem like insignificant to somebody, which may be humongous to someone
Mhm.
else. And in the world that I deal in the Sales Game Changers, the Institute for Excellence in Sales world, I mostly deal with the people who had you talk about the sources of fear experiences where either they've said, that doesn't bother me. That's not even a thing for me. Or as we're going to be talking about in session 6 and 7, about how you can overcome these fears. And that's the whole purpose of us doing this, of you writing the book and of us doing this podcast, is to let people know two things. One is, like you just said, false evidence appearing real. You can get past this to be successful in sales or business, and not just in sales and business, but in life.
Absolutely. I think about sales, and because I did my stint in sales where I was picking up the phone and cold calling for oil and gas. And I really think about the perspectives of sales today and the digital world we're in. It's really hard to approach somebody face to face and try to sell something. So like car salesman is a perfect example of this. Door to door salesman knocking on doors and trying to sell something face to face. So then we have pick up the phone. So that's a little bit distance, right? I don't have to look at them. They're not looking at me. Smile when you're talking, all that kind of stuff. But it's easier because I don't have to look them in the face. Then we have the advent of email marketing and email sales. So I can just fire off emails all day long. And if they decline it, whatever, like there's no, like unless I get a response message that says, go to heck, like it's pretty easy. And then I can text message, or I can just create a post that's selling on social media. But you see that like a lot of the behavior in sales today has migrated to because of fear, to avenues that protect us from our fears, because we don't want somebody to tell us no. We don't, that fear of rejection, right?
Yeah.
And it's easier to be rejected by being ignored and ghosted on an email or a text message, or just nobody says anything on your post, versus being face to face with somebody and they're like, go away.
Well, you know what
So
though? Yeah, but it's not even the go away. It's actually, as you're talking this description, I agree. It's the converse though. So at the Institute for Excellence in Sales, we typically deal with companies that do enterprise selling, complex selling. There's multiple people that you need to influence. Imagine if you're selling some type of software security system to a hospital system. You're not just talking to one guy, one time, and he's going to spend $1 million on your solution. It's a long, drawn out process. Sometimes there's rules, there's budgets, there's presentations. You have to maybe influence 7 to 8 people. One of the challenges that we see right now is that it's easy to gravitate towards the texting and the social media. And a lot of people who are coming into sales, a lot of the more senior sales people are telling us that they don't like to interface with humans, right? The whole generation, the 20s and the early 30s, they're
they're
used
all
to
growing up.
well, yeah, but they're used to communicating not via face to face. I
Hmm.
talked to a senior sales leader recently, and this is a great example of this. I talked to a senior sales leader recently at a well known brand that most of our viewers and listeners are familiar with. And she took some of her younger salespeople, junior salespeople, I should say, on the sales call. And the customer spoke for a couple of minutes. And instead of replying with more questions to get deeper into the challenge, her salesperson went right to the close. Well, that's a big challenge. Here's our price list, and I can give you a 20% discount on. And the sales leader, who was in her 40s, I guess, was cringing. She said, we prepared for this call. We role played. We mapped it out about what we're supposed to say when the customer says X, and we're supposed to give the customer space. And she said, my rep went right to the close, which obviously was received by the customer as,
You're
why
not
are
listening.
what are you not listening? Exactly. You're not listening. So there was a fear there, especially when you're relatively new to sales, John, that you're only going to get one chance. So you got to like quickly get to the close. And I've had people who've tried to sell me and they've gone to a 40-minute presentation instead of asking one simple question. You talk about triggers. Help us understand what triggers might be.
So triggers in our life is the things. that have happened to us, they appear. So let's take that phone call as an example of where this is happening. So this person probably is has a fear of rejection, has a fear of ridicule or something of that nature. And the important part is really to name it, define it. We'll talk about that in a couple episodes in depth about how to deal with these things a little bit in this chapter. But when they have that fear, they can go through life just fine. But then something happens. And this is really clear when you're dealing with people with post-traumatic stress.
Hmm.
So post-traumatic stress is that they have a smell, sound, just an atmospheric change that can bring them back to an environment where they remember the situation. They remember what happened. And more than likely, this person got to the point where they know what they're supposed to do, but that trigger hit them of I'm going to get declined. So I'm just going to jump in there because I lose like all sense of my brain just like disconnects. Because really it is an emotion that we really have very little control over.
Yeah.
You imagine that when you feel fear, what happens to your body? The chemical reactions that are going on, the pit in your stomach, the sweats, the shaking that I can't control. Where's all that coming from? And then you don't know what's happening and you just snap and you respond with a way that typically you would respond in the past. So
Yes.
either just jump out there and hit them with the clothes and let's get off this phone call because they don't know what to do, or you go back to home and close your door and lock it. But that's what happens when you understand why these things happen. So if I put on a pair of shorts, it's a trigger to me about things that I feared in my past.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And
I attended a workshop. I was probably in my early 20s, and part of the workshop it wasn't really a sales training. It was more of like an enrolling, how to enroll people in activities in your life. And this was in the early 80s, and I remember the leader. There was like 300 people in the room, and he was talking about the process. And this was before emails and social media. And he said, you pick up the phone and you call someone. Hey, I want you to join me for this. You're very pumped and you're prepared. Hey, I want you to join me, John, for this event that I am attending. Uh, no, thanks. Okay. Then you call the next person. Are you available on Saturday? I really want you to attend this event that I'm doing. Gee, I'm not interested. Oh, okay. Then you call the third person. Are you busy on Saturday? What are you doing? It's like, I don't want to go anywhere with you on Saturday. Then finally, in the fourth call, it's like, you don't want to join me on Saturday, do you? What? So as humans, we are triggered by those kinds of things. But
mhm,
here's the thing, though, as you're
repeated
giving
repeated abuse.
repeated abuse. But here's the thing: the person on the other line, on the other side of the call, they're not in your head. They don't know your history. They have their own history. Now, if you're selling a solution, we tell this to people all the time. You're not selling something, you're providing a valuable service to the customer. And the people who are great at sales, they don't think of themselves in the negative, pejorative way that, maybe some people think of car salesmen or whatever it might be. The people that we work with at the Institute for Excellence in Sales, they're selling valuable stuff that's changing infrastructure, and it's providing solutions to the citizens, and it's helping improve healthcare, right? And it's helping make hospitality venues more effective, if you will. So, we tell people in the sales a lot, like, the person you're talking to isn't in your headspace, right? They have their own, and they may not be interested in hearing from you today, but it's not that they're not interested in hearing from you. They're busy with something else. I used to be when someone would reject me when I would propose my sales offerings, you would take it personally. Some cases you might sit there for an hour, like, what did I do wrong? Or why they seemed nice the first time I spoke to them. Now it's like, okay, next, move on to the next one, come back in a week, maybe talk to my boss. Now, what could I have done differently? Should I have called maybe not at 5:30 at home, type of a thing. So we're going to be spending the next couple of episodes talking about how to put proactive steps in play so that, like you said, you're going to have the fear, but you still need to create your business. You still need to get more prospects. You still need to develop your business. You still need to create partnerships. Still need to reach revenue goals. You talk about exploring your basis for fear. Why is it important to understand, first of all, identify the fear, and then secondly, understand where it comes from? Is that really important for people in business to go through that process?
Well, in anything, it's really about, so the very first step, I'll jump just a little bit ahead into chapter 7 and just say the first thing you have to do is you have to name your fear. I've said that in other podcasts, but
Mm-hmm.
specifically, I'll take anybody who's following this with the book in their hand, page 53, because we've now addressed, like, where do these fears come from? What are the triggers that, kick these things off? But the exploring the basis of the fear is what page 53 and 54 are about.
Yeah.
And it's really the first step in this, which is the first step in chapter 7, is about naming the fear. Then, when you understand what you're afraid of, because a lot of times we feel the fear, but we don't recognize it as a fear.
Yeah. Mm.
And it's not unless now that we've gone through half of this book, that we start to go, oh, that's a fear. I never really
Mm.
realized that's a fear.
Yes.
So now you have it in your head. Okay, that's a fear. I can see fear in the moment. That's mindfulness is really all about
Mhm.
being able to recognize things in the moment and then make a decision on what do you do about it.
Yes.
But when you can recognize it, then maybe you write it down. And a little bit later, I'm going to try to understand this. So one of the things is to reflect on your experiences that are associated with this fear. Why am I afraid of dogs? Why am I, and I'm not, although I I have had a fear where a dog was related, but I love dogs. Why am I afraid of horses, which I'm
Mm.
not,
Mm.
but
Yes.
like I know a lot of people that are.
Yeah.
So you start to reflect on where did these fears come from? And then what are my personal thoughts and beliefs associated with that fear?
Mm.
This really starts to break the fear down for you.
Yes.
And as we recognize more and more of the fears, and in our conversations over the past few weeks, you started to recognize fears in the moment.
Yes.
And now this is the opportunity right here to just start thinking about, well, where the heck did that fear come from? Why does that fear exist? Let me understand it. Then we look for support and we take action. And that really is, I mean, like, this is the first step into trying to deal with the fears that we have as we go through the book.
All right. So at the end of each chapter, you have a section where people can answer some questions, and we've been going through that at the end of each show. So I'll go through that. So this on page 56, 55 actually, where fear comes from notes. And you provide space for people to consider what we just read. So you ask the question, you ask 3 questions here. What has changed about what you thought you knew about the origins of fear? So I wrote, I realize now that everything we do has fear rooted in it. Even choosing to get out of bed, it's helpful to know where they came from so you can address them. And as you go through the book and as you get better at identifying these things, they become much smaller. My son was a hockey player growing up, and he played all the way through college, and he was very good. And in his club, there were 3 levels. There was the elite, there was the medium, and there were the lower level kids. And I remember his hockey coach, when he was at the elite level, said the elite kids move on from fear quicker. They might get hit, but they get back up, right? Next play, that type of a thing. The elite football quarterbacks, they might have just gotten sacked, 10 yards, and now they have to go an additional 10 yards, but they get right back up and they throw a 50-yard touchdown pass. The Tom Brady's. He said, they process that setback or that fear a lot quicker. And then I would watch the middle level kids, And you would see that they might stay on the ground for maybe an additional 2 seconds if they were knocked down. Well, as you're sitting on the ground, the rest of the play has moved forward. No one's like, the other teams aren't saying, hey, get up. They're like, let's take advantage of this. And then the kids who were at the lower level, God bless them, they were, you could see that they would be afraid to get hit. So they would lose the puck. And then the other kids would grab the puck and skate by them. So you see the varying levels. It's how quickly can you identify the fear and recognize, I'm afraid to call the CIO of IBM about my solution. Why is that? And instead of like waiting another year to grow, it's like you go seek some help or you figure out a new strategy. Second question you ask is, where have your professional fears originated from? And I know we've talked in the past and you've posted about the imposter syndrome, which we haven't spoken about today, but we've spoken about before. I have an example. I worked at Apple Computer for a long time. And before I went to work at Apple, I worked for McGraw-Hill Publishing in one of their divisions. And I got a job with Apple. And this was in the late 80s. Apple was the best company in the world at that time. And it's been the best company at various times over the last 40 years. And in my previous job in McGraw-Hill, I was like a star in the small division where I worked. Apple in the late 80s had very high criteria for hiring, right? And the people that they hired in this particular sales group I was invited to work in worked at Xerox and IBM and Oracle. And these people were hugely successful that had been recruited to Apple. And I remember I was like, what am I doing here? It's like, it's kind of like, when you go from high school, you're with all the smart kids, then you go to college. And if you go to a good school, everybody's smart, right? Not just like 30 kids, all of a sudden it's like the whole freaking school. And I was like, oh, these people, yeah, these guys have been doing it for 20, 30 years. And I went to one of their sales leaders' houses and it was like a mansion. And I'm like, I don't belong here. It's like, what am I doing here? Well, the reality is I did belong there because they invited me to come work there. Um, Another example, which this is even like a smaller one, my first job with McGraw-Hill, I was hired into a brand new group. They were developing, educational resources. And I was hired the day before everybody else. I'm not very mechanical, John. I was a history major in college and I have an MBA. I'm not very mechanical. I was asked by my boss to build a bookshelf for the new people who were going to be joining the team. And this was before IKEA. And I was like banging on this to make this bookshelf work. Instead, I should have been screwing and not banging. And my boss, who was a director level, came out of her office and looked at me and she said, what the hell are you doing? And I said, I'm building the bookshelf like you asked. She said, that's not how you build a bookshelf. And she went back into her office and she was under stress for whatever.
Thanks for telling me.
Thanks for telling me. Gee, I want to quit. I don't want to work here anymore. And then that's the last time I put myself out like that.
Let me share something really quick here.
Yeah, please.
So I talk about this in my book, Becoming Unbelievably Successful. When I was in high school, it's the personal computers started coming out. I had one of the very first personal computers that ever existed. And Texas Instruments TI 4A is like little tiny computer that it is just, but I was just so excited about it. And the courses started coming out in high school and I took every one of them. And when I was going off to college, it was going to be in computer science. The one thing is I really wasn't very good in math. A lot of that originated from switching schools in elementary from I was in old math and they were in new math. But that's, it's sort of an aside, but I get to college and I'm like, just feeling so good about myself. And here, all of my peers are in trigonometry and calculus, and they're programming in assembly language. And here I'm pretty happy because I know QBasic and a little bit about Fortran and Pascal.
Mm.
And you know what? It completely shut me down.
Yeah.
And I failed straight F's in college.
Mm.
My parents like wanted me so badly to, get my degree, go work for a big, company,
Yeah.
retire, blah, 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 the whole American dream back then. And they encouraged me to go back, but that that whole fear of I wasn't good enough. And I look back on it now and I'm just like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like I could have definitely learned. And I
Yeah.
work with computers all the time, and often I'm like the help desk to a lot of people. But it's so crazy when you look back at these things and what they have done to you.
Yeah. We know it's interesting. That's a great example. And as I'm thinking now about those two examples I just gave, all the sales leaders at Apple's, they love me because I worked really hard in what I did, right? And I still talk to some of them to this day. It's been 35 years. And I remember the one guy who was like our senior VP of sales. I was like, I treated this guy like he was like Tom Brady, and he was so kind to me, invited me to his house. I remember once I said to him, hey, this is about 2 years in. I said, can we have a conversation about my career? And he goes, I've been waiting for you to ask. Yet here I was, like I would avoid walking down the same hallway. God forbid we make eye contact. And this is like at Apple, this wasn't like, like at some of the place where I was really insignificant. Everybody, no one thought the negative things that were going through my head. And the other example I used too, I made her very successful, my boss, and she was very fond of me and actually hired me to follow her to another place. But I remember that one day banging on the bookshelf, and the look on her face, I was like, I'm done. I'm never going to volunteer for anything else. I'm toast there. The last question you ask is, how does exploring the basis of your fears help you to understand and overcome them? And I think that's critical. You need to know that you have the fear so that you can move forward, as we're going to be talking about in episode 6 and 7. So, John, are there any final thoughts that you want to share before we wrap up this episode?
And that question really is the basis of now where we are, is that, exploring the basis of your fear, recognizing that it exists. What is it doing? Where is it coming from? Boom, we're now stepped to this point where now we have a really good understanding of the fears we have.
Mm.
And in the next episode, what we will talk about is that everybody has those fears.
Everybody does. All right. Once again, this is the 5th episode of the Crossing the Zone of Fear podcast. You can find it on YouTube. Well, again, if you're watching, you see that it's on YouTube. Please give us a thumbs up. And if you're listening to this as a Sales Game Changers podcast, feel free to give us a 5-star review. John Knotts, I'm excited to be with you on this journey, and I'm excited to move on to chapter 6 and 7. My name is Fred Diamond.